just the way
I don't have to curve the exam.
Okay, let's be nice.
You don't have to get what it is.
That's true.
They wanna like help
Skip the whole
themselves out.
thing. Kill you right away.
At least that's
Well,
not
let's not do that one.
Let's not do that, bro. We've been talking about the dynamics involved in changing the savings rate when we're dealing with our solo growth model. And how these changes affect things. Okay. So if we start out with a quantity of capital that is greater than, right, the steady state, and we move towards the steady state, level of capital is above. Let me do that differently. Let's set up a this is the golden rule steady state. But if we have, and so the savings curve would have to intersect right there. If we have a steady state in the short run that is above the golden rule steady state, how do we get to the golden rule steady state? How would we change things to get to the golden rule? We would try to find a way to reduce the savings rate. Can't do anything about the depreciation rate. Can't change the production function. The policy lever available to us is the savings rate. So what do we do to change the savings rate? Well, how can we get people to save less? Maybe cut taxes? Maybe increase taxes on investment. Right? What else do we do to get people to save less? Get rid of any kind of tax credits on money that you put into savings, so no 401k or anything like that, get rid of those kinds of programs. You reduce the savings rate. You with me? When we reduce the savings rate, it doesn't happen all at once. Or at least the economy doesn't adjust all at once. You can reduce the savings rate all at once. Boom. Here's your exogenous shock. But today we're still here. Today we're here. So what happens? Well, this amount gets saved. This amount wears out so that next year there's less capital. And so we move towards the golden rule steady state, or the new steady state with the lower savings rate. So what happens to investment? We were at a steady state and investment was pretty constant. But when we introduce this shock to the savings rate, what happens to investment? Well, immediately investment falls. Then what? Well, interestingly, in the short run, investment falls, but in the long run, what happens is investment falls a little bit more. Right? You have this big drop, and then as we move towards the new golden rule, right, we asymptotically approach, right, a new investment level that is consistent with the golden rule level of investment. So this is over time. Okay. What happens to consumption? we were in a steady state. How does consumption adjust over time?
Goes up. One.
It goes up, immediately it goes up. There's a shock, right? That this is no longer being saved, instead it's being consumed. So consumption leaps up, doesn't it? But then what? Can you think it through? So what happened? As we move from here to here, what happens to consumption? It's going to decrease, okay? Because this gap between the savings line and the output line gets smaller as we get towards over here. It'll decrease as we move towards the steady state. But when we finally get to the steady state, the new steady state will be higher than the old steady state level of consumption. Why? Because that's why it's the golden rule steady state, is because it maximizes consumption in the long run. Right? The gap between the depreciation line and the production function is greatest at the golden rule steady state. So as we have initially a shock that we have a lot more money to consume right now, but as we move down and towards the origin here, consumption is decreasing, but in the end, our new steady state level of consumption is going to be higher than our original steady state level of consumption. Otherwise, we wouldn't have bothered with this whole business anyhow. Right? This is the maximum level of consumption in the long run. Questions? What happens to output? We were at a steady state level of output. What happens? Anybody got any ideas? I was watching Jeopardy last night. I got home from delivery. And I had already gone to bed. And I was still wide awake from conversation over dinner. And I actually rode back with our guests. So we're talking the whole way home. So I was wide awake and my mind was going like crazy. And so I turned on Hulu, and they're having the college Jeopardy championships right now. It's all college students. And let me tell you, I don't know if I can get into college today. Smart students, smart people. Of course, they picked like the smartest 9 out of all the college students in the country. I was talking about Jeopardy just because I was thinking of using the Jeopardy theme song to wait for you guys to give me an answer. So, who's figured out what happens to output? Yes.
When a total output decreased,
Total output decreases. Does it happen all at once or gradually?
there'd be a shock, wouldn't there, to some extent?
I don't think there's a shock actually here, because what happens is savings rate decreases, and gradually the amount of capital in the economy decreases such that output decreases from here to here. So I think output just sort of does one of these numbers. Okay, it asymptotically approaches a new total level of output. You're allowed to get the answer wrong. It's good. It's good to get the answer wrong now rather than later too. Advancing your understanding. Okay, well, let's do it again. But this time, we'll do it for an economy that initially has a savings rate below. That's not far enough below, but below the golden rule, and it's in a steady state. How do we get? Well, my wires are sloppy. How do we get to a higher level golden rule? Well, we've got to boost savings, right? So I didn't include savings last time in our analysis. What happens to savings? If we shift savings up like this, what happens to overall savings? We were at a steady state, and we change the savings rate, right? Okay, what happens to savings? Well, there's a shock. You're saving more, but then after that, output is increasing. So as output increases, savings increases as well. And approaches a new level of savings. And you have this shock where you have this savings rate and you move up to this savings rate, so boom, you're going to be saving more than you were before. But then as you move in this direction, the savings rate is also going up. Not the savings rate, but the amount of savings is also going up. Not the savings rate, but the amount of savings is also going up. You follow? Okay, well then what happens with consumption? We're at a steady state. We boost the savings rate. What happens to consumption? Yes.
It falls.
Initially it falls, right? Why? Because this which we had been consuming, we are now saving, right? But then what happens in the long run? Output goes up. And where do we land in the end? Consumption goes up, and eventually it asymptotically maxes out higher than it was before. That's why we're moving to a golden rule steady state, to increase consumption. That's what we're trying to do here, right? So it has a negative effect initially, but then it bounces up. Okay. What happens to, I guess savings is similar to what happens with investment, right? That's what we did last time we did investment. What happens to output? You have a steady state level of output. What happens? Savings increases, but we're still here. So what happens to output? It gradually increases to a new steady state. Higher than it was before. So these are interesting kinds of graphs to draw to think about what's happening. The most surprising ones, I think, are the consumption ones, because in this story we initially increase consumption, but then it decreases, but the final result is still higher than we started at. In this one, we decrease initially, but then increase, and we're higher than we started at. Okay. Early political economists like Adam Smith and those folks were also affiliated with folks like Jeremy Bentham. You guys know anything about Jeremy Bentham? You ever heard the name Jeremy Bentham? Bentham was a utilitarian. You give that person their credit. There's Jeremy now. And I do mean literally. That's Jeremy Bentham. He had himself embalmed when he died, and you can go visit him. His body is there at the University College of London. You can go say hi to Jeremy. He was in New York a couple of years ago, hanging out. Right? Why would you do that? Jeremy Bentham was somewhat stoic in his philosophy. He thought that the worst thing that could possibly happen to a person is not to die, but to be forgotten. The thing that we hate about dying is the fact that nobody thinks about us anymore. And we want to be thought of. We like to receive the approbation of our peers. Right? And if you're dead, and people stop thinking about you, they're no longer granting you approbation. However, if you can make an icon out of yourself, then people might still come by and look at you. Might even talk to you. And demonstrate that approbation towards you. Okay. So he believed in this thing called auto-icon. That's actually Jeremy right there. They made a wax face for him. But that's his hat, his clothes. Jeremy Bentham. Okay. Why was I talking about Bentham? Oh, because utilitarianism and related to utilitarianism, we can think about the motivations behind utilitarianism, one of which is the greatest good for the greatest number. Or similarly, don't do anything to anybody else that you wouldn't want them to do to you, which is basically the golden rule. And so the maximum consumption level on the solo model is called the golden rule level, not from the Bible, but from utilitarianism. It could be from the Bible too, but that's something they have in common, right? This golden rule, and other cultures also have something like the golden rule as well. But that's where it comes from. It's deep in the DNA of political economy, so to speak. The thought that's always been there. Okay. Did anybody do a Fed watching thing for today? Is that you, Eli?
Yes.
All right. Let me pull that up real quick. All right. Here's Eli's article. Is it showing on the screen? It is good. Tell us what you got here, bud.
So basically, because inflation has been running pretty high lately, I think at like the fastest rate in 40 years, there are indications that the Fed will increase its interest rates next month. So like with the tensions between Russia and Ukraine, it doesn't appear that that's going to change the Fed's plans to increase interest rates. However, these tensions could lead to higher inflation. So during the conflict, like oil and gas prices have already increased, and so like if they continue to increase, these higher fuel costs could lead consumers to spend like more of their budget on energy. So officials have said that this isn't like I mean this is one risk among many, but it's not like, at least right now, it's not like the leading macroeconomic concern, according to James Bullard, the president of the Fed Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and sick.
All right,
So,
very good.
Yeah.
Did anybody else bring news today? I think somebody else was supposed to do today. Today's date is the 23rd. Cameron? Cameron in the room? Anybody know Cameron? No. Usually it's there, doesn't he? No, different guy, different Cameron probably. That's my audio Cameron. Okay, maybe he dropped. I don't know. I'll have to get on him about that. Hey, it happens, right? Other similar thoughts. Right, we've got Russia and the Ukraine in tension, right? What's the GDP of Russia? 1.43 trillion. What's the GDP of the United States? And we got a feel for that, you should by now.
Is it 20.94 trillion?
Thank you. Notice also on here, the GDP of China is 14.72 trillion. Our economy is bigger than China's. What's the GDP of California? The GDP of California is twice the GDP of Russia. The GDP per capita of California is around $79,000. GDP per capita, Russia, is around $10,000. The average Californian has 8 times the income of the average Russian. But they have to pay to live in California. What about Ukraine? GDP per capita in Ukraine is around $3,800 a year. Very poor relative to Russia. Total GDP in Ukraine? $155 billion. That's definitely wrong.
That's so dumb. I don't believe it's right, Bill.
That's gotta be wrong. I could be wrong.
Somebody went on Wikipedia.
Is that's in millions though, right? So that would be,
352 billion.
yeah,
Beg your pardon?
but it's in millions.
Yeah, so
so
it
it's-
would be 300.
Oh, it's a million, so it's 350. Thank you. All right. So the GDP of Indiana is twice that of Ukraine. Do y'all have any idea how rich you are? Do you have any conception of how incredibly well off you are? I have a hard time appreciating it myself, right? It's very difficult to maintain perception, perspective on these kinds of things. So Ukraine and Russia may have this military conflict. And Russia's gonna invade the Ukraine for what? $155 billion a year? I'm not feeling it. Right? I don't know. I go back and forth on this. One thing that's true about economists is that we do not understand foreign policy at all. We're like, why y'all fight and let's get rich? But people like to fight. So, okay. That's all of that. Did I want to do anything else with this? Is Ukraine rich or poor? I think I just did. Afghanistan's GDP is 20 billion. That's not a mistake. That's a lot of mistakes. I'll gather it up. All right. GDP, and I think I've done this for you before, but $500 a year is GDP per capita in Afghanistan. Right. The guy that we're helping out from Afghanistan is working for $15 an hour, and he sends about $500 a month back to Afghanistan, which is basically quadrupling the quality of life for the people that he's sending the money back to. And we want to fight about whether or not to put solar panels and gas. I'm sorry. That's not as interesting to me. It is interesting. I like getting involved in that sort of thing. Most days, an opportunity to teach a little bit of economics. Okay. Questions? In our model, we've been talking about the relationship between output and capital. And capital we defined earlier at little k as effective capital, capital per worker, and output we defined as total output per worker. And from that, we get this equation that a change in output per worker results in, right, a change in total output, a change in savings, and depreciation. So capital changes based upon the relationship between output as conditioned by savings and depreciation of existing capital. Well, how do we change this to take account of changes in population? Because it's not only capital that can change, population can also change. We're gonna give population the label N. Okay, so if we change N, it's gonna change the K over L relationship. And we bake that in by saying that effective capital is affected by changes in population in the same way that it is affected by changes in depreciation. So we add a term to the end of our equation here to account for changes in population. And we can collect these two like terms so that changes in capital are related to one of the three K here, crap. Like this. And once we incorporate population like this, we say, oh, population is changing in the same exact way that depreciation is changing, and depreciation changes by a straight line. And so we're going to use the same straight line to be for both changes in depreciation and changes in population. We're just going to add it on, tack it on there. And if we just had depreciation, it would be like, here's depreciation, and here's depreciation plus population. So what this does is that as we change the amount of savings we do, right, we want to adjust our savings to achieve a golden rule level of savings per output, but we want to take into consideration not just some constant rate of depreciation of capital, but also some constant rate of population growth, such that the relationship K over L, capital per worker, remains constant, or that it is chosen in an optimal way, so that consumption can per worker can be optimized. We have to take changes in population into consideration in order to do that. So you got to give some. So you've got to give some of the new workers some capital too. Right? The output per worker has to do with how much capital each worker can use. So we want to give each new worker some capital also. So now when we find the steady state level of capital, where the changes in the amount of capital are zero, right? Investment, all the savings that occurs, that investment that happens, it has to pay for both the capital that depreciates, but it also has to pay for buying new capital for the new workers so that they're able to produce at the same rate as the old workers were producing at. You want everybody to be equal, so to speak, in this economy. Right? That's not the goal, that's an assumption. So you gotta give the new workers some capital too. As N increases, what happens? If population rate grows faster than we expect, right, we find ourselves at a new lower steady state, lower level of consumption, lower level of output per worker, less capital per worker. If population grows and nothing else changes, everybody who is already in the country is worse off than they were before. That is assuming no Smithian growth. It is assuming that the new workers that enter into the economy are not helping us all to specialize a little bit more. But that is what happens. Extra workers help us all to specialize a little bit more. And when we all specialize, each of us becomes more productive at whatever it is that we're doing. So this is a model, and the model might seem to basically imply adding people makes me worse off. I'm calling baloney. No, there's things that this model does not describe well. Right? Adding more workers tends to improve the quality of life for most people who are already in that country. You know whose jobs are most threatened by migration in the current policy regime? Which kinds of industries have disproportionately more immigrants?
Could be like unskilled labor.
Unskilled labor is one, but that's the kind that we're trying to limit with laws. Under the current policy regime, whose jobs are most threatened? Or who faces the most competition? Me. Think about the number of faculty that are not American born at this university and at other universities. Think about it within Muncie, right? Where there are the most internationals? The college campus, right? Now that's mostly because the current policy regime is making it more difficult for those skilled workers to migrate and easier for high skilled workers to migrate. But I'm the one who's the most at risk here, currently. And I'm like, you can stay with me. That's literally my Twitter response. 9 times out of 10, when somebody's like, immigrants bad, I hashtag, they can stay with me. You can take your idea. Dark smoke there. So high population growth under the solo model with that element added in would seem to imply that we would result in a situation of poverty. But I say that's probably not a very good analysis. Okay. Let's take what we've done here so far and do a little bit of algebra with it. Oh, you know what? No, I'm gonna hold off on that. I want to talk more about immigration and population. Okay. Why are there differences amongst countries? Why is there variance among countries? I guess I should use sigma for differences. Why are some countries rich? Why are some countries poor? What affects savings and depreciation and population growth? Savings might be the product of culture. Some cultures are more place a greater emphasis on savings than others. That might have to do with the vulnerability of that culture to invasion from bad guys. countries that were regularly invaded by bad guys saved more. But they didn't invest. They saved it and hid it under their mattresses. Savings would be typically in the form of food or rice or capital equipment that, actually probably most likely gold and jewelry and things like that. If you're at risk of being robbed by the tax collector, presuming the tax collector in this particular case is not benevolent. It's a wild assumption, but right. And the tax collector comes around, and what are you gonna do with your extra rice? You're gonna hide it under the floorboards. And so people hid a lot of their produce to save it because they're afraid of having to pay the tax man. And so savings didn't get invested into new productivity. So savings is part of the culture, but it didn't lead to growth. Why? Because of what Anker Olson called the stationary bandit. This is Anker Olson. The story goes like this: so back in the day, when civilization started to develop and people started to adopt agriculture, there were bands of roving bandits that would maraud the countryside and go from one community to another and rob from these farming communities, and that's how they made their living. One day, one of the stationary bandits got lazy. And being lazy, he said, what I'll do is I'll build a castle next to one particular community, and I will tax them, and I will tell them that I am taxing them to protect them from all the other bands of roving bandits. And so they became the stationary bandit, and thence we get a government. That was his idea of how government came to exist. And the stationary bandit actually is helpful because the time at which the tax man is going to come to take from you is more predictable. And so it may have actually encouraged development of in infrastructure and capital relative to pure roving bandits coming and taking your stuff occasionally. So you may get economic growth once you've got a stationary bandit and once you've got a government, because at least you don't have roving bandits. Better not to have any bandits at all, but maybe that's not a world we can get to. Okay, what can we do about changes in population? What happens if people live longer? Population grows. What do I mean by living longer? Well, I could mean the average lifespan changing from 35 years to 70 years. And if the average person only lives to be about age 35, then most of their lives, they are not productive. Most of their lives, they are consumptive but not productive because they're too little to help, right? Their work is not as valuable. Whereas if people live longer, right, then they become more productive longer in their lives. Until they get old, really old, and at which point they're again less productive, right? So is there a peak age for people within a society? What do we do about the Oxford comma? What's the Oxford comma? I went to the store to get apples, oranges, and cheese. We put this comma here to separate things in the sentence. Well, what if the sentence is, let's eat, Grandma. And we get rid of the Oxford comma. Then we're saying, let's eat Grandma. Right? So we live amongst an aging population. People are having fewer babies. I recommend that some of you get busy with that. We could use more babies. I'm pro baby. kinda like them. I keep on pressuring my daughters to find boyfriends because I want grandchildren. Children are merely intermediate goods. Grandchildren is what we really want. You're laughing because it's true. But as we have a rapidly aging population and fewer young people, then each of you young people are going to have to spend more of your income taking care of more old people because there's fewer young people and more old people. At some point, the young people are gonna be like, no. No, I'm not paying to keep somebody else's grandma alive anymore. Grandma is 85 years old. The doctor says she needs a surgery. The surgery is gonna cost $25,000. If she gets the surgery, she's expected to live 6 months longer. Without the surgery, she's gonna die soon. Hello, that's a lot of money to keep an unproductive old person alive for 6 months. I'm stating facts. Why do we continue to do it? There's a sense of morality that's involved, right? There's a normative element to this. I can't talk about that like I do all the time, but I can't tell you what you should believe or what you should think, right? I'm identifying the opportunity cost. Right? Your Nana is in the hospital. She needs this surgery. It's going to cost $50,000. It's going to keep her alive for an extra year. Wouldn't she rather get the surgery and spend the $50,000 on that, or use that $50,000 to pay off your student loans and your sister's student loans so that you can get a head start on your life? Right now, she's not making that decision because the $50,000 is being paid by a third party, the insurance company or the government, in other words, you. Not only are you not getting the $50,000 to pay off your student loans, but you're also paying the $50,000 for grandma to get her surgery. You're out $100,000 to keep grandma alive for that time period. Pretty sure there's something weird going on with my math there. Right? Is this true? Well, in the countries where population has gotten older earlier, we see cultures that are more receptive to policies like euthanasia. Should we be surprised? I'm not. I'm not at all surprised. Whose job is it to take care of grandma? Have you and your cousins had that conversation? What happens if there's a war? How would a war affect an economy? Well, how would it affect the rate of depreciation? If there's a war and a foreign country comes and starts bombing your factories, the rate of depreciation is going up. More capital is wearing out faster because it just blew up. What happens to population? Some people are getting dead. So population is going down. What's happening to the overall level of capital? Right? Because I kind of took care of that through depreciation. What about savings rates? What's happening with savings rates if there's a war? I don't know. Right. World War II, what did Americans do? How did that affect their savings rate? Another way of asking that question is to ask what happens with the consumption. Consumption went down. People bought war bonds. People rationed their access to consumer goods, right? In the trade-off between guns and butter, we moved in that direction, right? What happened during the war in Afghanistan? Did this happen? Not so much, right? Not so much. It was financed differently. To the point where you didn't actually feel the cost of the war that much. Not only that, but this didn't happen very much. Right? At least not amongst the people that we know. Right? Who is it that's dying? People in other countries and also low-class Americans. Right? Disproportionately minorities or new immigrants that are soldiers, that are infantry. Right? Upper-class soldiers fly airplanes. They get dead less often. What about depreciation in the most recent war? That didn't happen here, so we didn't lose a lot of capital. Actually, in World War II, we didn't lose a lot of capital either, while all of Europe lost a lot of capital and all of Asia lost a lot of capital, which is part of why after World War II, we became the dominant economy in the world because our capital didn't get broken and destroyed. We were way ahead of everybody else because we still had a lot of factories. Okay, I'll see you on Friday.